The championship game riot erupted when 80,000 fans turned violent after the controversial call, and the stadium security supervisor had 15 minutes before the crowd destroyed everything and everyone in their path. What the rioting fans didn't know was that the man coordinating crowd control wasn't just checking tickets. He was a former riot police specialist whose crowd psychology training had prepared him to calm mass violence that could turn deadly in seconds. For 12 years, Tony Martinez had been the invisible force that kept MetLife Stadium safe during the biggest games in professional sports. As head of security for one of the NFL's premier venues, he oversaw crowd control for up to 82,500 fans during events that ranged from peaceful family entertainment to emotionally charged rivalries. To the cheering fans and team personnel, he was simply Tony, the professional security supervisor who somehow made managing massive crowds look effortless. What they didn't know was that Tony carried credentials that would have shocked the entire sports industry. Hidden in his apartment was a police certificate documenting 15 years with the NYPD Riot Control Unit, including specialized training in crowd psychology and mass violence suppression. The same eyes that now watched for unruly fans had once maintained order during civil unrest in New York City, where crowd control meant the difference between peaceful resolution and catastrophic violence. Those 15 years had taken Tony through some of the most challenging situations in urban law enforcement. Riot police officers were specialists in crowd dynamics, mass psychology, and the complex process of restoring order when large groups of people became violent. Tony had controlled riots in Times Square, managed mass protests that turned hostile, and learned to read the subtle behavioral indicators that predicted when crowds would transition from excited to dangerous. The transition from riot police to stadium security had been surprisingly natural. Both jobs required understanding group psychology, anticipating escalation before it occurred, and maintaining order among large numbers of people whose emotions could change rapidly. The main difference was that sports fans were usually celebrating rather than protesting, but Tony knew that celebration could turn to violence just as quickly. MetLife Stadium was one of the most challenging crowd control environments Tony had managed. The facility regularly hosted 80,000-plus people for NFL games, creating conditions where any incident could affect tens of thousands simultaneously. The stadium's design meant that crowd control errors could result in stampedes or mass violence that could kill hundreds. Tony had been monitoring concerning trends in sports fan behavior that reminded him of pre-riot conditions he'd observed during his police career. Social media was amplifying team rivalries, alcohol consumption was increasing aggressive behavior, and the emotional investment that fans had in game outcomes was creating situations where controversial calls or unexpected results could trigger mass violence. Today's game was particularly concerning. The NFC Championship between division rivals had drawn a sold-out crowd of 82,500 fans, many of whom had been tailgating for hours. The emotional stakes, alcohol consumption, and tribal loyalty created perfect conditions for crowd violence if anything went wrong during the game. What worried Tony wasn't the normal fan enthusiasm. It was the combination of factors that could turn routine sports excitement into the kind of mass riot that his police experience had taught him could destroy everything in its path. The championship game began with typical high energy. Tony positioned himself in the stadium's security command center where he could monitor crowd behavior throughout the facility while coordinating with his team positioned in different sections. The initial fan response was intense but manageable, loud, passionate, but following the behavioral patterns that Tony had learned to manage during major sporting events. By the second quarter, Tony was observing crowd dynamics that concerned him. The game was exceptionally close, with momentum shifting repeatedly between teams, creating emotional highs and lows that were affecting fan behavior in ways that reminded Tony of his riot police experience. Fans weren't just watching a game, they were experiencing emotional extremes that could become dangerous if triggered by the wrong event. Tony activated enhanced monitoring protocols and began positioning additional security personnel in areas where his crowd psychology training suggested problems were most likely to develop. His experience with riot control had taught him that mass violence typically began in specific locations and spread through crowds like contagion, so preventing initial incidents was crucial for maintaining overall order. At the beginning of the fourth quarter, with the game tied and emotions at peak intensity, Tony observed the first serious warning signs. Fights were breaking out between opposing fans, alcohol-related incidents were increasing, and the general crowd behavior was exhibiting what riot police called pre-violence indicators, the behavioral patterns that preceded mass disturbances. Tony began implementing what police doctrine called de-escalation protocols, subtle crowd management techniques designed to reduce tension and prevent the kind of triggering events that could cause localized incidents to spread into stadium-wide violence. His goal was to maintain the excitement that fans expected while preventing the emotional overflow that could turn celebration into destruction. With 6 minutes remaining in the championship game, the controversial call happened. The referee's decision to overturn a touchdown that would have won the game for the home team was immediately recognized by Tony as exactly the kind of triggering event that his riot police training had prepared him to manage. The crowd's reaction was instantaneous and dangerous. 82,500 people simultaneously expressing rage at a level that Tony knew could transition to mass violence within minutes. But the situation became critical when fans began throwing objects onto the field, storming barriers, and exhibiting the kind of coordinated aggressive behavior that marked the beginning of sports riots. Tony realized he had approximately 15 minutes before crowd psychology reached the point where violence would become unstoppable and spread throughout the entire stadium. The transformation from disappointed fans to rioting crowd happened exactly as Tony's riot police training had taught him to expect. The controversial call created a shared sense of injustice that unified 82,500 individual reactions into a single dangerous mob psychology. Within minutes, fans were no longer spectators at a sporting event. They were participants in a mass riot that threatened to destroy the stadium and everyone in it. Tony watched through security cameras as the riot spread through different sections of the stadium, using the same patterns he'd observed during urban civil unrest. Initial incidents in the lower sections were creating copycat behavior in upper levels. Alcohol was amplifying aggressive responses, and the crowd was beginning to target stadium infrastructure, security personnel, and each other, in ways that could quickly result in mass casualties. Tony activated the stadium's emergency response system and began implementing what riot police called mass crowd control, tactics designed to restore order when traditional crowd management had failed and violence was already occurring. His 15 years of experience had prepared him for exactly this scenario, tens of thousands of people expressing collective rage in a confined space where conventional law enforcement response would be inadequate. Working with stadium management and local police, Tony began coordinating the kind of comprehensive crowd control operation that most security professionals had never encountered. The challenge wasn't just stopping the riot, it was preventing the mass stampede that could occur if 82,500 people tried to leave the stadium simultaneously while in a state of panic or rage. Tony's first priority was implementing what riot police called crowd segmentation, dividing the rioting mass into smaller, more manageable groups that could be controlled individually rather than allowing the entire stadium to function as a single, uncontrollable mob. Using the stadium's public address system and strategic positioning of security personnel, Tony began creating psychological barriers that interrupted the crowd's unified behavior. His second action was more direct. Moving through the stadium to the sections where the riot was most intense, Tony began implementing the kind of personal crowd control that riot police officers used when mass psychology needed to be interrupted by individual authority figures who could command respect and attention even during violent situations. Tony's appearance in the rioting sections had an immediate impact. His riot police training had taught him how to project the kind of calm authority that could interrupt mob psychology and remind individual people that they were accountable for their actions. The techniques that had worked during urban riots proved equally effective in stadium settings. Tony began implementing what riot police specialists called psychological crowd control, using his understanding of mass behavior to de-escalate violence by addressing the emotional and psychological factors that were driving the riot, rather than simply trying to suppress it through force. Tony's first technique was what police doctrine called leadership displacement, identifying individuals who were driving aggressive behavior and neutralizing their influence. Tony's experience had taught him that riots were often led by a small number of people who influenced larger groups, and removing these leaders could cause mass behavior to change rapidly. Moving through the rioting sections, Tony used his authority and crowd psychology training to isolate the most aggressive individuals, while providing alternative leadership for fans caught up in mob behavior. The key was offering people a way to express their frustration without violence. Tony's second approach was addressing the underlying cause of the riot, the sense of injustice that had triggered the mass anger. Using the stadium's public address system, Tony began providing information about the referee's decision and the appeals process, giving fans a sense that their concerns were being heard and addressed through legitimate channels rather than violence. The technique that proved most effective was what riot police called crowd validation, acknowledging the fans' emotions while redirecting their expression toward nonviolent outcomes. Tony's announcements recognized that fans had legitimate reasons to be upset while making it clear that violence would not change the game's outcome and would only result in consequences for individual participants. Working with local police who had arrived to assist with crowd control, Tony coordinated a systematic de-escalation that addressed different sections of the stadium, using techniques appropriate for the specific crowd dynamics in each area. His riot police experience allowed him to adapt tactics based on the varying intensity and behavioral patterns he observed. By implementing what amounted to urban riot control techniques in a sports venue setting, Tony successfully interrupted the mass psychology that was driving the violence. Within 45 minutes, he had converted a stadium-wide riot involving 82,500 people into manageable crowd control situations that could be resolved without mass casualties or extensive property damage. When the state police riot control units arrived to assist with the emergency, they found Tony coordinating a controlled de-escalation that had prevented what could have become one of the deadliest sports riots in American history. State Police Captain Rodriguez, who had commanded riot control operations throughout the region, asked Tony how he had managed to stop a mass riot involving over 80,000 people without significant violence or casualties. Riot police. Tony replied, 15 years of crowd psychology and mass violence control. Same principles, different venue. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Tony had prevented. Crowd behavior experts from the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety analyzed video footage from the MetLife Stadium riot and concluded that Tony's intervention had likely prevented what could have become the deadliest sports-related disaster in modern history. Dr. Sarah Kim, who led the federal investigation into stadium crowd safety, explained to Tony that sports riots were among the most dangerous crowd control situations that law enforcement could face. Once a crowd reaches the size and emotional intensity we saw at MetLife, traditional security measures become inadequate, she said. The physics of crowd dynamics, combined with the emotional amplification of sports rivalry, can create conditions where hundreds of people die in stampedes or are killed in mass violence. The video analysis showed that Tony's intervention had broken the riot's momentum at multiple critical points. By implementing crowd segmentation, he'd prevented the stadium-wide coordination that could have resulted in catastrophic property destruction. By addressing crowd psychology, he'd interrupted the mass behavior patterns that were driving violence. By providing alternative leadership and outlets for fan frustration, he'd given people ways to express their emotions without contributing to dangerous mob behavior. The final outcome was remarkably positive considering the scale of the incident. 23 people treated for minor injuries, mostly from pushing and shoving during the initial crowd surge. No serious injuries, no deaths, and minimal property damage. Crowd safety experts noted that riots of similar scale typically resulted in dozens of deaths and millions of dollars in destruction. The NFL, recognizing that Tony had saved both lives and the league's reputation, offered him the position of Director of Stadium Security for all league venues. The sports industry also began implementing new crowd control protocols based on Tony's Riot Police training for high-risk games and events. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the International Association of Venue Managers, which invited Tony to develop new crowd control standards for large-scale sporting events. His successful management of the MetLife Stadium riot became a case study for how riot control expertise could be adapted to sports venue security. The story spread throughout both law enforcement and sports industry communities, as an example of how specialized police training could find crucial application in civilian settings. Tony's tactical response became a model for how riot control skills could be transferred to stadium security operations. 6 months later, Tony Martinez was no longer just a stadium security supervisor. The MetLife Stadium incident had led to his appointment as Director of Sports Venue Security for the National Football League, a position that included developing crowd control protocols for all NFL stadiums nationwide. Tony created a comprehensive training program that brought riot control expertise to the sports industry. The curriculum included crowd psychology, mass behavior prediction, riot prevention techniques, and what Tony called sports crowd management, maintaining fan excitement while implementing security protocols that could prevent mass violence. Security personnel at stadiums across the country learned to recognize crowd density indicators and behavioral patterns that Tony had first studied during riot police training. They practiced riot response scenarios, coordinated with law enforcement more effectively, and developed the situational awareness that could prevent mass violence before it occurred. The program was so successful that it attracted attention from the Department of Homeland Security and international sports organizations, both of which began incorporating Tony's methods into their guidelines for large-scale event security. What had started as one veteran's career transition became a model for applying riot control expertise to civilian sports venue protection. Tony's story spread throughout the veteran law enforcement community as an example of how specialized police training could find meaningful application in civilian settings. Officers who felt their riot control and crowd management skills were underutilized began to see new possibilities for service in their communities. But perhaps the most important change was in Tony himself. During his police career, riot control had often meant managing hostile populations during civil unrest or conflict situations. The crowds he was controlling were frequently angry, frightened, or actively opposing law enforcement objectives. In the sports industry, Tony discovered a different kind of crowd control work. Every game that proceeded safely, every championship that concluded without incident, every rivalry that was decided on the field rather than in the stands. These were positive outcomes, where his tactical skills enabled entertainment and community rather than suppressing conflict. During quiet moments before major games, Tony still surveyed crowds with the same tactical awareness he'd brought to riot control operations in New York City. But now he understood something that had taken him years to learn. Protecting people didn't require them to be in opposition to authority. Sometimes the most important riot control work happened in places where nobody expected to find a former police specialist, places where mass violence was prevented before it could start, where communities could gather safely because someone with extraordinary training chose to use those skills to protect celebration rather than suppress disorder. Tony Martinez had spent 15 years managing crowds during some of New York's most dangerous civil unrest. Now he spent his time ensuring that sports fans could enjoy games without fear, knowing that someone with the training and commitment to prevent mass violence was watching. And in the end, he realized both missions were exactly the same: using specialized skills to protect people from harm, ensuring that human gatherings could proceed safely, regardless of whether those gatherings were motivated by civic engagement or athletic competition.